What is the new Green New Deal?
So the Green New Deal is essentially a proposal to tackle what we define as the twin crises of income inequity and climate change at once. So the idea actually, in part, came from the UK. So the UK released, I think the think tank's IPPR, they released a Green New Deal right after the financial crisis. And it sparked some thinking in some of the founders at my org and other folks. And so the Green New Deal came out of that, and now it is an effort to marry the fights against climate change and income inequity, because especially in the States, they really feed one another, right? So we know that more inequity means more emissions, right? People who are wealthier create more emissions. We also know that when there's an ability to sort of protect yourself from climate change and leave other people vulnerable, that means that the ruling class, can you say the ruling class? I don't know.
The elites? I don't know.
The elites are not as motivated to deal with climate change, and it happens in the reverse too. So climate change affects poor people, especially poor people of color, a lot more in the States. So you can think about Hurricane Katrina, you can think about the wildfires in Paradise, California. Those are folks who most of their wealth is in their homes. When those homes are gone, they don't get that wealth back, right? When their farms go underwater, farms that they've had for generations, that's the end of a family's livelihood, right? And so climate change is steadily increasing the gaps between who has and who doesn't have.
Exactly. So I guess on the Green New Deal, it's essentially a resolution at the moment.
Yeah.
Could you just, for those of us not from the US, just explain where it is in the process? What does it mean by
a resolution?
Yeah.
So it essentially means that the Green New Deal is not law yet. And it also hasn't gone to the floor. So I feel like I'm about to give you all a terrible civics lesson. So we have three branches of government, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. And so a resolution essentially means that the House, it's come to the House and come to the Senate to say that we believe in these things, we want to move forward. And then part of the work that I do is developing the policy so that it can become legislation, go to the floor, become law.
Gotcha. So tell us a little bit about that. What is your role in this? How did you get involved?
Yeah, so I work at a think tank called New Consensus. And so in the US, the Green New Deal sort of fight, struggle, whatever you want to call it, has been largely led by three groups. There's a Sunrise Movement. Have y'all heard of the Sunrise Movement? Kind of. So they're a youth movement that is like doing the organizing, the people power part of it. There's another org called Justice Democrats that essentially works with electeds and candidates to do it. And then New Consensus, we develop the policy for the Green New Deal. Because what we have recognized is that there is a real hunger for young people, people of color, to be activists. But once it moves out of that space, everyone's like, okay, now the real adults will come and fix it, which usually means get out, here are the white men. To fix everything. And so New Consensus was designed and is working to sort of fill that gap so that the voices of the people who are making this a movement carries over to the policy and it serves them too. And I came to this work, I actually didn't really work on climate or the environment until this. I did some policy work on environmental justice before, but honestly, in the States, environmentalism can seem sort of like a white issue because it's mostly around nature and animals, and I think it can be divisive sometimes, at least back in the day, where you have sort of Black people getting shot by cops, and the response is not the same as like the polar ice caps melting. And so I think a lot of people of color were like, great, I don't care, or I don't know how this involves me. And I felt the same way, and it was really working on the Green New Deal that helped. And so my background is in sort of the social policy aspects of the Green New Deal, which is why I was brought on to sort of think about those structures and how they intersect and how you can build policy that both decarbonizes and advances equity at the same time.
Great. So building on that, decarbonizing, dealing with equity issues.
Yeah.
Why are we so bad at connecting the dots between those two things? So far, it feels like they've been very separate conversations. You've obviously experienced that. So what are we doing wrong?
I think there's a couple of things. The first is that we tend not to think, I think it's changing, but I think sometimes we don't tend to think of climate change as a system or something that's affected by systems, but as sort of like a single issue. But the fact is, like, climate change has everything to do with the ways that we structure businesses, right? The ways that we allow fossil fuel companies to move, which is written into legislation, right? It's about the ways that we structure our economy. So I think that's one thing. And then I think often we have talked about sort of how to stop climate change from a very individual perspective. You reduce, you reuse, you recycle, you take a bus, you don't use a plastic water bottle. And all of that, you know, has a role, but we haven't, I think for sort of the general public, the idea that like climate change or that the real thing that you want to do is sort of move systems is new. And then I think the last thing is I think, and this is just a theory, is that I think folks have not taken people of color seriously as environmental voters or actors. And so it's also been treated as like a thing that people of color, especially if they don't have a lot of money, won't care about. Despite the fact that they are more likely, based on polling and studies, to care than other groups. But I think sort of we've left them behind. And so I think outside of the environmental justice movement, there's been a real sort of struggle to figure out how do you frame these issues in a way that connects, and really not a lot of tension into how you do that.
Got it. And how are you trying to do that now with this process as you're writing the policies that will go into the Green New Deal as it is?
So one of the first things that's caused a lot of consternation is that the resolution came out and it didn't specify any policy specifics, right? It laid out projects that we need to do, work that needs to be done, principles, but no concrete policy. And that was for two reasons. One was to start a conversation, right? From like just the presentation we just had, we know that we have the knowledge to sort of fix these systems, right? So it's about knowing what's happening and getting resources to that, and you can't do that if you are deciding on high what's going to happen, nor can you hear from communities that are really affected. So that's one. And then the second reason was that we didn't want to break a coalition, right? To actually pass something like the Green New Deal in the States, where the political landscape is so fractured, you need to have a broad coalition that can withstand sort of difference. And if you come out with policy specifics from the very beginning, particularly if you haven't done consultations with communities of color, frontline communities, et cetera, you're breaking your coalition before you even started. Because people already feel like they weren't involved, this wasn't for them, this didn't concern them, and it's the same thing that happened before. So that's one of the ways that we're doing it, is sort of slowing down the process. Our process at New Consensus is really consultative, so we're building like advisory groups. 50% of those advisory groups have to be people from frontline or vulnerable communities. So folks will be directly impacted. At least 50% have to be women. At least 50% have to be people of color, right? And so that is, and you don't get double credit for women of color. And so that is slowly changing. That's going to change the solutions that we come up with. That's going to change the way that we think about the problems. So that's sort of the first way that we're thinking about, that we're working on doing that. But it's really about sort of opening up the policy process to allow more voices to speak in and shape.
Great. And what's the voice of business in all of this? So we today here, we've had a lot of big corporates, a lot of really great startups are going to be presenting soon. How have you been involving them in this conversation about decarbonization and equity?
Yeah, so we are really interested in involving business, although that generally shocks people when I say. They expect me to be like, get out. But, their money is green too. And so, or multicolored here. And so business has a huge role to play because the Green New Deal is expansive, it's comprehensive, and so much of what will allow this to happen is businesses being involved and investing. Because at least in the States, there are billions, if not trillions of dollars waiting to be invested once the federal government sets a clear decarbonization strategy and plan. Because people are not going to change their business models if they don't know if the market will exist the next year, right? Or the next 5 years, next 10 years. And so they have a huge role to play. We involve them as experts, right? We consult with them, we will talk to them. Because the fact is that our model is World War II, which was a very sort of public-private partnership. And we're aiming for the same thing. The only difference is that we don't want government to continue to be the handmaiden of the private sector. There has to be equal partners sharing, and the government does have the right and the role to set regulations, to set the sort of playing field. And so we embrace that, but of course that still means that the private sector has a role, and quite a big role to play. We can't produce all the things we need for a Green New Deal without a private sector. We can't fund innovation the way that we need without a private sector. We can't train workers and get them jobs without a thriving private sector. So there is no universe in which the Green New Deal works without business involvement and a very active private sector.
Yep, definitely. One common criticism that the Green New Deal seems to be getting, and a lot of ideas in this space get, is that this is ridiculous. This is going to cost way too much money. We just can't afford that right now. What's your response to that?
I was like, what is a helpful response to that? Because I think there's a couple of responses. One is that when most people are dead, they can't spend that money anyway. So what are you saving it for? But I think the other response is that this is an investment program, right? We are talking about investing in the next generation of businesses. We're talking about investing and changing our economy so it is more circular, right? And that takes money to change it, right? So these are investments that means that they will give dividends, they will give returns in terms of economic growth or jobs, what have you. And the alternative of inaction is not only is it expensive, that money is just, you are basically clogging a leak, or like, I don't know, I'm not a carpenter,
I know what you mean.
whatever. You're plugging a leak, right? And so the money that you spend when climate disasters happen, once that's over, that money's gone. That's not an investment, right? When your coasts are underwater, you're losing money. That's not an investment. You're not getting a return on that. And so the alternative is like, yes, it will cost money, but it will actually give us something in the end versus inaction, which is essentially just bleeding until you die.
I'm not going to end on that note. One last question for you.
I mean, some of us won't die.
Exactly. We'll be fine.
Some of us will be fine.
So I guess last question for you. What's next? Where do we go from here? What is it actually going to take to get this over the line?
So it's going to take a few things. So the first is continued pressure and political capital. And I think that's something that sometimes makes people uncomfortable because, I don't know, at least in the States, there's this mindset of like, you just ask really nicely until someone gives it to you, but we ain't got time for that anymore. Yeah. So, but pressure does build political capital, and the more this becomes an issue, the more people have to move. Yep. So that has to happen. The second is, we obviously need a supportive, hopefully presidential administration, a supportive Congress, and then of course we also have to move the world of ideas, which is part of what New Consensus does, because in addition to writing policy, which obviously has to happen for it to get to the floor, we have to be able to make or help shape an intellectual space where people can be grappling with these ideas in a way that matches the scale and scope of the problem. And that means widening the ways that we think about things, changing some paradigms, right? Introducing new worldviews. And that is sort of background work, but that has to happen for these ideas to be taken seriously and make it to the next level.
Definitely. Well, we wish you the best of luck. You have all of our support. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Of course, thank you.